Apple just paid $95 million to settle a lawsuit. The accusation was that Siri was secretly recording your private conversations for a decade. Medical appointments, financial planning, relationship problems, all captured without permission, all allegedly shared with advertisers. The settlement was announced in January 2025. 1 month later, Apple announced it's handing Siri's brain to Google. Not just any part of Siri, the entire foundation, the intelligence that processes your questions, understands your context, accesses your messages and emails, knows your schedule, sees your location, and learns your habits. Apple spent 15 years building a brand around one promise: what happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone. They position themselves as the anti-Google, the company you could trust with your data because they don't profit from mining it. That promise just died. January 12, 2026, Apple and Google announce a multi-year partnership. Google's Gemini AI will power the next generation of Siri. The revamped assistant launches this spring as part of iOS 26.4. Apple insists nothing has changed about privacy, but everything has changed about trust. Here's what's actually happening, why it should concern you, and what this means for the future of your data. Let's start with how we got here. For over a decade, Siri has been embarrassingly bad. Ask it to set multiple timers and it fails. Try to have a conversation with context and it forgets what you said 2 sentences ago. Request help with a complex task and it suggests you search the web. Meanwhile, Google Assistant, Amazon Alexa, and ChatGPT have been getting dramatically better. They understand context. They handle complex queries. They feel like actual assistants instead of glorified search boxes. Apple promised repeatedly that a smarter Siri was coming. At WWDC 2024, the company announced Apple Intelligence, a suite of AI features that would transform Siri into something genuinely useful. The assistant would have personal context, on-screen awareness, and the ability to take actions across apps. The features were supposed to launch in 2024, then they got delayed to 2025. Then Apple admitted in a statement that delivering on these promises would take longer than expected, and they anticipated rolling them out in the coming year. Translation: we can't do this ourselves. That admission set the stage for what came next. January 20th, 2026, Apple confirms it's partnering with Google. The next generation of Apple Foundation models will be based on Google's Gemini models and cloud technology. These models will power future Apple Intelligence features, including the long-promised personalized Siri. Apple's statement emphasizes that after careful evaluation, Google's technology provides the most capable foundation for what Apple wants to build. Reading between the lines, Apple concluded it couldn't catch up alone. Here's what makes this concerning. Apple built its entire brand identity around privacy. What happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone became the company's defining message. Apple positioned itself as the anti-Google, the company that protects your data instead of mining it for profit. That positioning wasn't just marketing, it was Apple's competitive advantage. People paid premium prices for iPhones partly because they trusted Apple with their information in ways they didn't trust Google or Facebook. Now Apple is handing the keys to Siri, the assistant that lives at the center of your digital life, to the company it spent years telling you not to trust. The privacy implications are immediate and significant. Apple insists user data will remain protected. The company says Apple Intelligence will continue running on Apple devices and private cloud compute, maintaining what it calls industry-leading privacy standards. But that assurance requires trusting a complex technical architecture that most users don't understand. Here's how it supposedly works. Simple Siri queries will be processed on-device using Apple's own models. More complex requests that require additional computing power will be sent to Apple's private cloud compute servers. Only the most demanding queries will leverage Google's Gemini models. And even then, the processing happens on Apple-controlled infrastructure running Apple Silicon. Apple describes this as using Google's brain power while keeping it locked in Apple's house, following Apple's rules. User data gets sent to Apple servers, processed using Gemini technology, and then the results return to your device. Google supposedly never sees or stores your actual queries. The technical term for this arrangement is white labeling. Google's AI technology powers the system, but Google's branding remains invisible. From your perspective, you're still just talking to Siri. But several problems make this setup concerning. First, the architecture is opaque. You don't know which of your queries stay on device, which go to Apple's cloud, and which leverage Google's models. Apple decides dynamically based on query complexity. You have no visibility into that decision-making process and no control over it. This creates uncertainty for every interaction. When you ask Siri about your schedule, is that processed locally or in the cloud? When you request a summary of your messages, does that involve Google's technology? You have no way to know. Apple provides no indicator, no dashboard, no transparency into which processing path your data follows for any given query. The lack of transparency matters because different processing paths carry different privacy implications. On-device processing keeps your data entirely local. Apple's private cloud compute theoretically protects your data, but requires trusting Apple's implementation. Google-powered processing adds another entity to the trust equation. Even if Google supposedly doesn't see individual queries, without knowing which path your data follows, you can't make informed decisions about what to ask Siri. The system treats privacy as a technical implementation detail rather than a user choice. Apple decides for you based on criteria you can't see or influence. Second, the technical safeguards depend entirely on implementation. Apple says there's a privacy buffer layer before any data reaches Google, but what exactly does that mean? How does it work? What data gets filtered? And what passes through? Apple hasn't provided detailed technical specifications that independent security researchers can audit. This matters because bugs, misconfigurations, and vulnerabilities happen. Complex systems fail in unexpected ways. Microsoft's recall feature had severe security flaws, despite assurances it was designed with privacy in mind. Google's Gemini had issues generating problematic content despite extensive safety testing. Every major AI deployment has encountered unforeseen problems. Apple's privacy protections will fail at some point. The question is whether those failures will be caught quickly, disclosed transparently, and fixed comprehensively. Apple's history suggests otherwise. The company typically downplays problems, responds slowly to criticism, and prioritizes reputation management over user interests. Third, even if the architecture works exactly as Apple claims, you're still trusting Apple to implement it correctly and maintain it properly. Remember, this is the same company that just settled a $95 million lawsuit over Siri privacy violations. The settlement creates a legal precedent that Apple has failed to protect Siri's privacy in the past. That failure wasn't a brief lapse or minor bug. It persisted for a decade. The company allegedly knew about the problem and didn't adequately address it until facing legal consequences. Why should users trust that Apple will handle this more complex, opaque arrangement better than it handled the simpler system, where everything supposedly stayed on device? That lawsuit deserves attention because it reveals Apple's actual track record on Siri privacy. The case, settled in January 2025, alleged that from September 17, 2014 through December 31, 2024, Siri recorded users' private conversations without permission. Apple then allegedly shared these recordings with third-party advertisers. Users reported Siri activating without the wake word being spoken. The assistant would listen to conversations about medical appointments, financial planning, personal relationships, and other sensitive topics. Later, users would see targeted ads related to those exact conversations. One plaintiff described discussing a specific brand of shoes with a friend. Days later, ads for that exact brand appeared on their device. Another reported talking about a medical condition and subsequently receiving ads for related treatments. Apple denied wrongdoing but agreed to pay $95 million to settle. Users with Apple devices during that decade-long period can claim up to $20 per device. The settlement highlights a fundamental truth. Siri has a documented history of listening when it shouldn't and sharing data it shouldn't share, and Apple knew about these problems for years before taking meaningful action. Now that the same company wants you to trust that its complex, opaque arrangement with Google will protect your privacy better than the simpler system did. There's also the question of what Google gets from this deal. Apple is reportedly paying Google approximately $1 billion annually to access Gemini models and cloud infrastructure. That's significant revenue, but it's not the real prize. The real value is validation and reach. Google's Gemini gets embedded into over 2 billion active Apple devices. That's an enormous user base that Google couldn't access otherwise. Every query processed through Gemini-powered Siri becomes a data point proving Gemini's capabilities. Even if Google doesn't directly see individual user queries, the aggregate performance data from billions of interactions is incredibly valuable. It demonstrates that Gemini can handle real-world usage at a massive scale. That validation helps Google compete with OpenAI's ChatGPT and positions Gemini as the industry standard. Google also benefits strategically. The deal deepens Apple's dependence on Google's infrastructure. Apple already pays Google tens of billions of dollars annually to be the default search engine on iPhones. Now add another billion for AI capabilities. That financial interdependence gives Google leverage in negotiations and makes it harder for Apple to switch away later. There's regulatory scrutiny to consider too. Google was found to hold an illegal internet search monopoly in September 2025. The court case raised questions about whether Google should be forced to divest assets like Chrome or be prohibited from making exclusive deals with companies like Apple. The ruling ultimately allowed Google to continue such deals, but regulatory pressure remains high. The Apple-Siri partnership adds another example of Google using its dominant position to extend into adjacent markets. Elon Musk publicly criticized the deal on X, calling it an unreasonable concentration of power for Google, given that they also have Android and Chrome. His concern centers on Google controlling too much of the digital infrastructure that billions of people depend on daily. Musk has his own competitive reasons for objecting. He runs xAI, which makes Grok, a competitor to both Gemini and ChatGPT. His company is currently suing Apple and OpenAI over their partnership, alleging anti-competitive behavior in the App Store. But the concentration of power concern is legitimate, regardless of Musk's motives. When one company powers the default search, browser, and mobile OS for half the world, and now the voice assistant for the other half, that's significant market control with limited alternatives. Then there are the internal concerns at Apple itself. According to reports from Bloomberg's Mark Gurman in October 2025, Apple employees don't trust the new Siri. Despite over a year of delays meant to perfect the AI-powered assistant, staff testers and engineers say the current version feels inconsistent and unprepared for public release. The concerns reveal deeper problems than just buggy software. Apple is reportedly running an internal bake-off between two competing Siri models. One team focuses on Apple's privacy-first on-device AI technology. The other explores Google's Gemini AI through private cloud computing. This split approach shows Apple hasn't decided which direction to take with its digital assistant, even as the spring 2026 launch date approaches. Internal teams are competing against each other with different AI approaches, fragmenting development efforts, and creating confusion about the product roadmap. Apple has also lost significant AI talent over the past year. Several senior executives involved in Siri development left the company. The remaining leadership faces ongoing scrutiny about whether they can deliver on Apple's ambitious AI promises. Talent turnover doesn't just mean empty desks, it means lost institutional knowledge, broken workflows, and teams that need time to rebuild trust and momentum. This brain drain puts Apple in a difficult position. The company needs world-class AI engineers to compete with OpenAI, Google, and Anthropic, but those engineers have options. Many prefer working at AI-focused companies where they can push boundaries without Apple's strict privacy constraints and slow decision-making processes. When your own employees don't believe in the product they're building, that's a warning sign. Let's talk about what this means practically for iPhone users. The revamped Siri is expected to launch in March or April 2026 as part of iOS 26.4. Apple promises it will finally deliver the conversational, context-aware assistant users have wanted for years. The assistant will supposedly answer more factual questions in a conversational manner, tell stories, provide detailed explanations, understand personal context from your messages and emails, and take actions across multiple apps based on complex requests. These are genuine improvements if they work as promised, but they come with trade-offs you need to understand. Every time Siri accesses your messages to provide personal context, that data potentially gets processed through systems involving Google's technology. Every complex query that requires cloud processing exposes your information to infrastructure that Apple doesn't fully control. The scope of data exposure extends beyond individual queries. Siri's context awareness means it builds a comprehensive understanding of your digital life. Your schedule, contacts, communication patterns, location history, app usage, browsing habits, health data if you use Apple Watch, financial information if you use Apple Pay, and document contents if you store files in iCloud. All of this information could potentially flow through private cloud compute systems that utilize Google's Gemini technology for processing. Apple says it uses encryption, anonymous identifiers, and strict data handling policies. The company says information sent to private cloud compute servers isn't stored or accessible to anyone, including Apple itself. But you're trusting Apple's implementation of those protections. You're trusting that the privacy buffer layer works as advertised. You're trusting that Apple and Google both honor the terms of their agreement about data handling. You're trusting that no vulnerabilities exist in the architecture. That could be exploited by attackers or abused by insiders. That's a lot of trust to place in companies that have billion-dollar incentives to maximize data usage and partnerships built on complex technical architecture you can't audit yourself. The trust required becomes even more problematic when you consider that you have limited alternatives. If you want to use an iPhone, you're accepting this arrangement. Apple doesn't offer options to use Siri without any cloud processing. You can't choose to use a different voice assistant as your default. You can disable Siri entirely, but that means giving up functionality that's increasingly integrated throughout iOS. This lack of choice represents a shift in Apple's relationship with users. Previously, Apple positioned privacy as an empowering feature that gave users control. Now, privacy has become something Apple decides for you based on technical limitations and business partnerships you didn't consent to and can't opt out of without abandoning core functionality. There's also the question of feature parity across devices. Apple Intelligence, including the revamped Siri, requires minimum specifications to run. Your iPhone needs at least 8 to 12 gigabytes of RAM and a neural engine capable of handling on-device AI processing. That means hundreds of millions of users with older iPhones are excluded from these features entirely. They're being pushed into a massive upgrade cycle to access basic improvements to Siri that should have been delivered years ago. This creates a two-tier system. Users with newer, expensive devices get AI-powered features. Users with older but still functional devices get left behind. The digital divide widens based not on need or preference, but on whether you can afford a new iPhone. Apple frames this as preparing users for the next generation of computing, but it's also forced obsolescence designed to drive hardware sales. Perfectly capable phones that handle all your actual daily tasks suddenly become outdated because they can't run AI features most users didn't ask for in the first place. Now let's examine Apple's strategic position and what led to this moment. Apple has always prided itself on controlling the full stack. Hardware, software, services, everything integrated seamlessly. The company built its reputation on not needing external dependencies for core features. That approach crumbled when AI became the defining technology trend, and Apple couldn't keep pace. While Google invested billions into AI research and infrastructure, while OpenAI pioneered large language models, while Microsoft integrated AI across its product line, Apple moved cautiously. The company's privacy-first approach and preference for on-device processing made it difficult to compete with cloud-based AI systems trained on massive datasets. Apple's leadership clearly believed they could develop competitive AI in-house while maintaining privacy commitments. That belief proved wrong. The technology requires resources, expertise, and scale that even Apple struggles to marshal quickly enough. CEO Tim Cook said during Apple's July 2025 earnings call that the company was making good progress on a more personalized Siri and expected to release features next year. Behind that optimistic statement was the reality that Apple was negotiating with Google because internal development wasn't producing results fast enough. The Google partnership solves Apple's immediate AI capability gap. It gives Siri access to cutting-edge language models without Apple needing to build them from scratch. It buys time while Apple continues developing proprietary AI technology, codenamed Ferret 3, for potential deployment in 2026 or 2027. But it also represents a fundamental shift in Apple's strategy. The company that defined itself by independence now depends on its primary competitor for a core feature of its flagship product. Some Apple leaders reportedly believe that large language models will become commodities in the coming years. From that perspective, spending billions developing proprietary models doesn't make strategic sense when you can license capable ones and focus on integration and user experience instead. That reasoning is pragmatic, but overlooks what made Apple special. The company succeeded by controlling the experience end-to-end. Depending on external AI means accepting that core aspects of user interaction are shaped by technology Apple doesn't fully control. It's the difference between designing the entire car versus buying the engine from someone else and hoping it fits your chassis properly. There's an irony worth noting. Apple currently partners with OpenAI to integrate ChatGPT into Siri for certain queries. That partnership positions ChatGPT as an optional fallback when Siri can't answer questions. Now, Google's Gemini becomes the primary foundation for Siri's capabilities. OpenAI, which many expected would be Apple's main AI partner, got relegated to a secondary role. The reasons reveal Apple's priorities. Google owns both the AI model and the cloud infrastructure supporting it. That gives Apple a stable, scalable solution that can handle billions of devices without risk of unreliable performance during peak usage. OpenAI, despite its technological leadership, depends on Microsoft's Azure infrastructure. That indirect relationship apparently made Google more attractive as a partner. Google is also more established in consumer AI deployment. Gemini powers features across Google's search engine, Gmail, Android devices, and Samsung's Galaxy AI. That track record of handling massive scale in consumer products mattered to Apple's evaluation. OpenAI has also faced leadership changes, internal realignments, and mixed reactions to model updates. Apple's cautious culture prefers established, stable partners over ones navigating organizational turbulence. The choice reveals that Apple prioritized infrastructure stability and proven scale over cutting-edge AI capabilities. It's a practical decision, but one that arguably settles for good enough rather than pushing for the best possible. So what should you actually do with this information? If you're an iPhone user, you need to decide how much you trust Apple's privacy architecture and how much you value the improved Siri capabilities versus potential privacy trade-offs. When iOS 26.4 launches with the revamped Siri, you'll have options. You can enable all features and trust Apple's assurances that your data remains protected. You can use Siri conservatively, avoiding queries that involve personal information, or you can disable Siri entirely and rely on other methods for the tasks you currently ask it to handle. Understanding what data Siri accesses matters. If the assistant has permission to read your messages, emails, and calendars to provide personal context, that information potentially feeds into cloud processing involving Google's technology. You can restrict those permissions in settings if privacy concerns outweigh convenience benefits. You should also monitor reporting about the actual privacy implementation once iOS 26.4 launches. Security researchers will analyze how data flows between devices, Apple's servers, and Google's technology. Their findings will reveal whether Apple's privacy assurances match reality or whether there are gaps in the protections. For people considering buying an iPhone specifically because of Apple's privacy reputation, this partnership should factor into your decision. Apple is no longer the company that handles everything internally. Core features now depend on partnerships with companies whose business models conflict with Apple's privacy messaging. That doesn't necessarily mean Apple devices are no longer private, but it does mean the privacy equation is more complicated than Apple good, Google bad. Both companies are now involved in processing your data, and you're trusting Apple to mediate that relationship properly. Looking ahead, 3 things indicate whether this partnership succeeds or becomes a liability. First, user adoption of the new Siri features. If people genuinely find the revamped assistant useful and don't experience privacy concerns or data breaches, Apple's gamble pays off. If adoption remains lukewarm or privacy incidents occur, the partnership backfires. Second, regulatory action. If US or European regulators conclude that the Apple-Google partnership creates anti-competitive effects or privacy risks, they could force changes to the arrangement. That would disrupt Apple's AI roadmap and require alternative solutions. Third, Apple's progress on proprietary AI. If the company successfully develops competitive in-house models within the next few years, it could reduce or eliminate dependence on Google. If internal AI development continues falling short, Apple's reliance on external partners deepens. The partnership also sets a precedent for how Apple handles future AI integration. If licensing external models works well, Apple might extend this approach to other features, services, and products. If it creates problems, Apple might return to slower internal development, even if that means falling further behind competitors. What's clear is that Apple has crossed a threshold. The company that built its brand on independence and privacy control has acknowledged it can't deliver competitive AI features alone. Whether that acknowledgement represents strategic flexibility or fundamental weakness depends on execution over the next few years. But AI represents the first major technology shift where Apple is playing catch-up rather than leading. The company underestimated how quickly AI would become table stakes for consumer technology. By the time Apple recognized the urgency, Google, Microsoft, and OpenAI had multi-year leads in capabilities, infrastructure, and deployed user bases. That miscalculation has consequences beyond just Siri. Apple's entire product roadmap increasingly depends on AI capabilities the company can't deliver independently. Future features for photos, messages, mail, and system-level functionality all require advanced AI that Apple is now licensing rather than building. This creates strategic vulnerability. If Google decides to end the partnership or demands more favorable terms in future negotiations, Apple has limited alternatives. OpenAI remains an option, but comes with its own dependencies on Microsoft infrastructure. Anthropic, Meta, and other AI companies could provide models, but switching requires massive engineering effort and introduces additional risk. For users, the question is whether you're willing to accept increased complexity and reduced transparency in exchange for a smarter Siri. There's no wrong answer, but there's also no going back to the simpler promise that what happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone. The new Siri might finally work properly, but it works by compromising the privacy principles Apple spent 15 years convincing you to trust. That trade-off should concern you. Whether it scares you depends on how much you valued those principles in the first place. Do you think Apple's privacy claims are still credible? Or has the Google partnership destroyed the trust Apple spent years building? Share your honest take in the comments.